Welcome to this explainer. All right, picture this. You've just been handed the keys to a brand new independent nation. Sounds amazing, right? But wait, this nation is actively going through a massive political revolution, crippling economic devastation, and complete social upheaval, all at the exact same time. That was the literal reality for the framers of the Indian Constitution. They were standing at a high-stakes crossroads, and they desperately needed a fundamental law of the land. Really, they needed a blueprint for sheer survival. To truly grasp the unbelievable weight of that moment, we just need to listen to Jawaharlal Nehru. He said, "The first work of this assembly is to free India through a new constitution, to feed the starving people, and to clothe the naked masses." You see, this wasn't some abstract academic debate in a quiet room. It was an absolute pressure cooker. In 1947, they had to tackle extreme economic backwardness, navigate the traumatic division of the country, and take on this monumental social responsibility, literally right out of the gate.
So what were their options? Well, to tackle this massive undertaking, the Assembly essentially had a menu of choices. Today we're going to look at a nation at the crossroads. Option 1, the Gandhian village. Option 2, the socialist perception. Option 3, the Euro-American model. And finally, the pragmatic final choice.
Let's kick things off with part 1, a nation at the crossroads and the immense challenges of 1947.
Like we established, framing this constitution was a pure survival necessity. The ultimate goal? To foster national unity, accomplish freedom, and strive for a true national renaissance. The Assembly's primary objective was to meticulously design political institutions that would forge an unbreakable unity. It was all about ensuring the nation's integrity, not just to get through 1947, but for all the decades to come. Which brings us to part 2. Option 1, the Gandhian village and the indigenous vision. Now, this was a distinctly indigenous, bottom-up philosophy based entirely on Mahatma Gandhi's ideals. The Gandhian village was envisioned as a social organization based on a stateless, classless society where, get this, a prime minister and a central government would be completely unnecessary. I mean, just pause and really imagine that for a second. Try to picture a vast, complex modern nation functioning with literally zero central government. It's a pretty radical idea, right? So how would that actually work? Well, a prominent Gandhian, Shriman Narayan Agarwal, submitted a formal blueprint where power wouldn't flow down from the top, it would flow upwards through indirect elections. Step 1 is your primary political unit, the village panchayat. From there, elected leaders move up to Step 2, taluka and district panchayats. Step 3 is the provincial panchayat, which handles things like transport and defense. And finally, Step 4, the All India Panchayat. The president of that body would basically serve as the head of state. The driving philosophy here was super straightforward. The government that governs the least is the best government. This perspective placed a massive emphasis on a rural, agro-based society. It completely rejected urban, Western mechanized exploitation and heavy state control. The founders of this idea believed that a highly decentralized system would bring democracy straight to the grassroots level, increasing individual responsibility and morally elevating the citizens. But here is where we hit the absolute crux of the Assembly's dilemma: the ideal village society versus the very harsh 1947 reality. On one hand, you have this beautiful utopian vision of a stateless, morally driven agrarian society. But on the other hand, the Assembly had to face facts. There was an immediate, desperate need for unified defense, centralized state welfare, and national integration. Ultimately, the majority of the members looked at the board and concluded that a decentralized, stateless society just couldn't survive the brutal geopolitical demands that India faced at that exact moment. Moving on to part 3, option 2, the socialist perception and the ideological debate. With the Gandhian model politely set aside, the Assembly considered a fascinating spectrum of socialist thought. This ranged from the gradual reformist ideas of Fabian socialists and followers of Harold Lasky, all the way over to strict Marxists. Now, the Assembly really favored the concept of a democratic constitution inherently tied to economic equality. They absolutely knew the country needed socialistic thought to fix its immense economic backwardness. However, and this is a really key historical distinction here, they firmly rejected the Soviet communist model. Acting strictly as historical reporters, we can see in the Assembly's records that they concluded the totalitarian character of the Soviet model simply would not suit Indian conditions. That rejection really came down to cultural pluralism versus the armed communist state. Assembly members believed that India's deep, intricate framework of cultural pluralism was fundamentally incompatible with a heavily armed communist state.
They strongly felt that such a model wouldn't promote the kind of liberal democratic liberty that the people of India had just spent decades fighting for.
Next up, Part 4, Option 3, the Euro-American model and the pragmatic synthesis.
This was the pragmatic approach the Assembly ultimately chose as the backbone of the nation. They took Western liberalism, Fabian socialism, and a mix of unitary and federal features and synthesized them into 5 basic postulates: federalism, secularism, democratic socialism, a parliamentary form of government, and judicial review. Now, these weren't just randomly pulled out of a hat. These 5 pillars were meticulously designed to interlock perfectly, preserving the unity and integrity of the nation while aggressively driving socioeconomic modernization.
Another huge factor for this choice was simply the continuity of tradition. You see, the Constituent Assembly leaned toward this Euro-American perspective partly because liberal democratic traditions had already taken root in India during the long period of British rule. It offered a familiar, road-tested framework. And when you're navigating a completely unstable time, having a system that can promote immediate stability is a lot more appealing than attempting a radical new experiment. Finally, Part 5, the pragmatic final choice and survival in a pressure cooker. To really understand this final choice, you have to look at the active threats stacked up against this newborn nation. First, the partition of the country created an incredibly adverse, unstable, and violent situation. Then you had the Telangana Communist Rebellion spiking fears of massive internal uprisings. On top of that, princely states were posing severe secessionist attitudes, especially in the Northeast. And, oh right, there was also a literal war over Kashmir, highlighting the immediate, terrifying danger of a Pakistani invasion. When you look at these overlapping crises, you really start to feel the overwhelming pressure cooker these framers were trapped inside. Because of all that, there was an absolute, undeniable necessity for a strong state, a state armed with invasion power to withstand these existential crises. These overlapping emergencies meant that a quote-unquote stateless Gandhian model or highly experimental socialist model were just way too risky. Plain and simple, national survival demanded a heavily centralized constitution that could lock the country together and withstand those immense external and internal pressures. Ultimately, the Indian Constitution became a pragmatic tool for survival, unity, and economic modernization. It wasn't just some ideological wish list. The Constitutional Fathers masterfully balanced subjectivity and objectivity. Actually, they did incorporate elements of the Gandhian and socialist models into the directive principles of state policy, things like village panchayats and economic equality. But when it came down to the hard machinery of government, they deliberately chose the centralized Euro-American model to securely anchor the newborn nation's future. So it leaves us with a really fascinating thought. If a nation's constitution is shaped so heavily by the intense, highly specific crises of its birth, what would a constitution written for today's world look like? It really makes you wonder how the historical pressure cookers of the past permanently shape the everyday laws we live by right now. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the incredible history behind the structures that govern our world.